History as it happens, April 27, 2021. The American Way of War.
We now know without any doubt what the price of inaction, of appeasement, of willful blindness will be.
To join again in authorization with our President, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America, to commit our young men and women in uniform.
That in the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. Tonight, we do not shrink from this responsibility, we embrace it.
Nearly 20 years after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, some members of Congress say it's time to repeal the blank check they gave the executive branch, the authorization for use of military force. Congress passed it nearly unanimously in the frightful days after 9/11, but it made forever war possible. Do American wars ever end anymore? That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Any vote that might lead to war should be hard, but I cast it with conviction.
Dwight Eisenhower was no pacifist. He oversaw the enormous buildup of America's nuclear arsenal. He gave the CIA the okay to topple democratically chosen leaders in Guatemala and Iran. He was a Cold Warrior, but in January 1961, after 8 years in the White House, he became a prophet.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded.
Yes, that is the famous military-industrial complex speech. And 60 years later, Eisenhower's fears have been realized. The U.S. defense budget is by far the largest in the world, and our wars have become like wallpaper, all around us but hardly noticed. If you've been listening to this podcast since it launched in January, well, first I'd like to say thank you. And you know that I like to bounce around from topic to topic, but lately I've been focusing on one issue. And that is war. The American way of war. Those voices you heard at the start, they were Republican and Democratic members of Congress explaining why they were voting in favor of authorizing the use of force in Afghanistan in 2001. And then you heard Senator Hillary Clinton voting for the war in Iraq in 2002, with the invasion coming a few months later. Those resolutions are still on the books, and they're part of a larger problem, if you believe it is a problem, what you might call the U.S. military empire. Now, supporters say this empire, with all its bases and aircraft carriers, our presence, protects the country from foreign adversaries. It keeps the peace. Well, we're going to test that claim in a conversation with an astute critic of U.S. war-making. John Glaser is Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. His research includes grand strategy, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, the rise of China, and the role of status and prestige motivations in international politics. John Glaser, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So what prompted some members of Congress to start considering, maybe even move toward repealing certain use of force authorizations that were passed in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks? And which specific resolutions are we talking about?
Well, it seems to me that there's some political momentum. It's a bit late, but the global war on terror has gone through 4 presidents now. And I think a lot of Americans are trying to assess the costs and the rate of return on investment that we've received from all of these various military interventions that are still ongoing. Authorizations for the use of military force that were passed in the aftermath of 9/11 are still operative. They're still on the books. The 2002 authorization for the use of force against Iraq is still technically on the books and cited by the executive branch to justify as legal rationale for a myriad interventions in the Middle East that have nothing to do with the initial intervention. Then, of course, there's the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, and that was to go after al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. That resolution has been stretched through 4 presidents to apply to, as I say, a myriad of security concerns and claims about terrorist threats throughout the Middle East and North Africa and even some places in Asia, rather than a relatively simple, straightforward, narrow authorization to pursue the perpetrators of 9/11 and those who helped them. It expanded into a nation-building project in one country, constant air war in several others, drone attacks, special operations forces. It's a kind of borderless, expansive permission slip for the executive branch to engage in war without congressional authority or consent.
And I would invite my listeners to check out the podcast you did at the Cato Institute's website about this very issue. You get into some of these details. So we're talking about the 2001 and 2002 resolutions, and some members of Congress, Democrats, Republicans, are thinking about actually advancing some legislation here.
That's right. I mean, if you look at the past couple years of U.S. politics, I think there's a chunk of politicians on both sides, in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, that are skeptical of this permission slip for executive unilateral war. Some of them are eager to try to check that, to do their constitutional duty and exercise their own authority in the realm of war powers. The problem is, it doesn't seem like that cohort can overcome the vast amount of support in Congress for our ongoing operations. And so what the momentum looks like to me is that there's considerable support in Congress for repealing the 2001 AUMF and the 2002 AUMF, but passing a new authorization, which would act as a new permission slip and start the clock anew on the global war on terror, in order to basically legitimize and codify ongoing operations in the greater Middle East from Libya to Pakistan. That's an example of Congress exercising its constitutional authorities in a very superficial manner. What ought to happen, I think, is that we ought to repeal these authorizations, and then Congress should wait on the president, who can identify a threat, present a proposal to Congress, and then Congress can debate it and decide whether or not to authorize. But this constant permission slip reverses the constitutional system. It's supposed to be Congress that decides our entry into war and the president that carries it out.
The U.S. Congress hasn't declared war since 1942 or 43. I believe it was Bulgaria. Folks can Google that one to make sure I'm right. But there are no anti-war protesters in the streets these days. So is there any grassroots pressure to repeal these resolutions, or is it coming from within Congress?
Well, I think there is public support for rolling back our military interventions. It's just that it's not top of mind for them.
Okay.
One of the problems that's happened, especially over the past 20 years, the American people are increasingly insulated from the costs of war or even the fact that we're at war. And so I've seen polling that's generally supportive of President Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, and that kind of thing is encouraging. But yeah, I think the problem is Americans aren't terribly aware of what our foreign policy is. Foreign policy isn't a huge priority to voters, traditionally speaking. And therefore, yeah, there isn't some sort of grassroots push to alter our foreign policy.
Of course, Americans aren't made to pay in the form of higher taxes either for all these wars. Whatever happened to the War Powers Act of 1973, which was passed supposedly to prevent executive branch overreach after Vietnam?
What the War Powers Resolution does is re-emphasize what the Constitution already says, which is that it's Congress's role to determine the nation's involvement in hostilities abroad. It allows the president to engage in hostilities for 60 to 90 days before alerting Congress of those interventions and justifying them in a national security sense. And then Congress's role is to formally authorize it at that point or not, at which point the president is supposed to withdraw. So if you think about Obama's intervention in Libya, for example.
He didn't even bother talking to Congress first.
Yeah, Congress never authorized it. So it's an unauthorized military mission, and they engage in all kinds of legal contortionism in order to justify it, saying, oh, this isn't actually a war, it's something lower, a kinetic military action, which is just a euphemism for war. And, the 60 days passed, and Congress didn't formally authorize our presence and our intervention in Libya. And then the 90 days passed, and still nothing. Obama did his duty in informed Congress that we were engaged in these military operations. But again, it's unfortunately seemingly defunct this quite important piece of legislation in the post-Vietnam era that was supposed to rectify the imperial presidency, this problem of increasing power shifting into the executive branch and away from Congress.
And that legislation was passed after one of the most divisive decades in our nation's history, when there were anti-war protesters in the streets all the time. So let's get into some deeper issues now relating to the American way of war, especially after 9/11. And that is, the U.S. is fighting an abstraction or an action, an ideology, however you might define terrorism, with conventional and covert military tools. And this is possible because of what the scholar Alfred McCoy described as a ring of 700 overseas bases, an air force of 1,763 jet fighters, more than 1,000 ballistic missiles, and a navy of nearly 600 ships, including 15 nuclear carrier battle groups. John, you've also written about our network of bases all over the world. All of this stuff makes war more possible, not less likely, right?
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about our global military presence, which appears to be permanent, is that it enables quick and efficient U.S. military action in any corner of the globe. The fact that we have roughly 800 military bases in 70 or 80 countries around the world, the fact that we have something like 250 to 300,000 troops posted overseas at any given time, the fact that we spend more on the military than the next roughly 10 or 11 countries combined, many of whom are our allies, the fact that China could double its military spending and we'd still outspend them on the military, and the frequency with which the United States is actually in a state of active war or hostilities, unbeknownst to most Americans.
I think in your podcast at Cato, you mentioned some lawmakers didn't even realize we had special forces in a certain country until a report surfaced that they had been killed.
Yeah, this was a couple years ago during the Trump administration. Special forces were deployed in Niger in order to assist government forces in fighting local militants who we describe as terrorists. And they got caught up in gunfire. And we lost several U.S. soldiers. And so, news got to Washington, and, some of the most hawkish individuals in Congress who insist that we really must be engaged in this fashion all over the world, were surprised that we were even in Niger. The fact that members of Congress are not even aware of the locations of U.S. deployed troops engaging in hostilities is a serious problem for our constitutional and political system.
The reason why I listed all of those items is because there's almost no public discourse about what all this costs, what benefit we might derive from it as a country, whether it's actually effective anymore, what's the goal, what purpose does it serve? What will it take for Congress to even hold hearings to evaluate just the network of bases, the 800 bases we have all over the globe?
Nothing stops Congress from holding hearings. They can do it whenever they want. The problem is the people who decide to hold hearings or not aren't objectors to this global military presence and constant state of war. They don't see much wrong with it. There's this assumption that, the United States is the leading country. We have benign intentions, unlike the other great powers, and that we have a responsibility to engage actively and militarily all over the world to protect global order, secure global peace, and pursue U.S. interests. And that's a worldview. That's an opinion about what U.S. foreign policy should be about. I think it's unconstitutional. I think it's contrary to most of our history. I think it's astrategic. And I think it's dangerous to our own political institutions. But nevertheless, it's a rough political consensus that this is the way we ought to conduct ourselves.
Well, an unchecked executive would have been anathema to the founding fathers. The idea that the United States needs to have a military empire, a century ago, that would have sounded bizarre to anyone in our country. I want to return to the issue of the Cold War and whether the post-9/11 way of doing things was a break from or a continuation of, because it's easy to overstate how much peace there was during the Cold War. The U.S. fought hot wars in North Korea and Vietnam. They did enormous damage to those countries. But even there, an invasion of North Vietnam was out of the question because of the potential Soviet response. So allow me to read a short passage from John Dower's The Violent American Century. He wrote, So, when the administration of George W. Bush responded to September 11 by declaring a global war on terror and launching the disastrous invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, it was not really deviating from the thrust of existing policy, as so many have argued. The excessive response to the atrocity carried out by al-Qaeda's 19 terrorists, inaugurated in the case of the 2003 invasion of Iraq by massive bombardment intended to shock and awe the foe, essentially involved unleashing a warfighting machine already primed and experienced in overseas interventions, including intensive bombing, covert operations, and practices on the dark side. And that is Dower's reference to the use of torture. So, John, my point is, the foundation for endless war was built long before 9/11, but without the constraint of the Soviet Union, it seems American leaders continue to lose sight of the very real limitations of military power. Why is that?
Well, I think there's all kinds of psychological issues that incentivize people to believe that we can be effective in these kind of endeavors. There's a tendency to look at the world and see tons of threats, to ignore the good, and to have overconfidence in our own ability to mitigate those threats or to challenge competitors. I think what this all boils down to is, what is our objective? Why are we engaged in these various military operations? 9/11 was a traumatic event, but it wasn't a harbinger of things to come. It wasn't the establishment of a new normal. It was an outlier in every sense. And since then, on average, I think about 6 Americans per year are killed in the United States by something that can be described as terrorism. Mostly that's from lone wolves who are self-radicalized here in the United States and have zero connection to overseas groups that have an actual operational connection to any of them. We've inflated this threat. It's easy to be fearful and to justify all of this military action. If you scrutinize it, the threat of terrorism is actually pretty minor and pretty manageable, should be pursued mostly through intelligence and law enforcement. It's not a war to be won, it's a problem to be managed. And instead, we've taken the war route. And I think that's the fundamental problem.
If you had made those remarks, say, 15 years ago, you would have been called any number of things. You don't support the troops, you're soft on terrorism, you're not patriotic. Those cultural, political, psychological pressures might be ebbing a bit, where we can now at least openly question the wisdom of fighting the war on terrorism as a war. But it's still difficult to do that.
Well, I think for a lot of people it is. It's difficult. It's not difficult for me.
No,
I have some kind of embedded skepticism of power, and especially government power. And so that leads me to scrutinize these kinds of things. But I think, most Americans are not terribly moved. And, when it comes to politics, Americans, as I said before, don't tend to prioritize foreign policy. They vote based on political identity, party, and then a few top-line pocketbook issues. They should understand that foreign policy is technically a pocketbook issue. We're spending almost $1 trillion per year on our national security. As you say, there are political and cultural incentives against pointing some of this out. You have to be patriotic, you have to support the troops, etc. But I'm a long way from there.
Well, I think you found a good place to be if you're skeptical of government power, the Cato Institute. Let's wrap it up with your thoughts on where we started, with the potential repeal of some of these use of force authorizations. How do you respond to the argument that the United States should not leave Afghanistan even after 20 years because the country could become a terrorist haven again?
There are all kinds of risks associated with withdrawing from Afghanistan. You just have to admit that, even though I support it. The simmering civil war that's ongoing there is likely to get worse if we leave, or when we leave in September. It's even possible that the Taliban eventually come back into power. And so that does raise the question, as you point out, are we under threat from a terrorist safe haven that could be established in Afghanistan once again? And again, I think this misunderstands what happened on 9/11. Terrorist safe havens, the notion that terrorists need a kind of plot of territory and privacy in order to plan their attacks, I think that misunderstands things. The 9/11 was planned partially in Afghanistan, sure, but also in Hamburg, Germany, and in Malaysia, and in Boston, In a time of instant communications across borders and oceans, terrorists have the ability to plan and coordinate attacks without having a piece of territory in remote, impoverished, landlocked Afghanistan. It's just not an effective launching pad for transnational terrorist attacks. It simply isn't. If you understand that, I think you can understand that, in fact, the threat of terrorism or al-Qaeda gaining a presence in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan and then using that to attack the United States, I think that's profoundly unlikely. And in fact, if you look at all the terrorist attacks that have hit us since 9/11, I don't think any of them have come from terrorists in a safe haven. The Taliban, helpfully, don't present an immediate threat to the United States. I think their relationship with al-Qaeda, at least among some factions in the Taliban, has soured over the years. They're certainly not looking to invite another US invasion or occupation. And they don't really have ambitions beyond Afghanistan's borders. They want to rule Afghanistan in the way they see fit. And so I don't think that there's a serious imminent threat emanating from Afghanistan. We can watch it, monitor, try to use our intelligence in order to evaluate whether or not there are legitimate threats emanating from there, but we can pull back and not worry about it. Now, I think we should think about welcoming some Afghan refugees who want to be free from the chaos and the violence that might befall Afghanistan in the aftermath. Beyond that, we have very little ability to manipulate how things go on the ground.
Two ways of looking at the American presence in these countries. One way is that it is pacifying, it brings stability. The other way is it catalyzes the insurgency.
Yeah, look, when we went into Iraq, there was not really a terrorism problem in Iraq. But a few years in, the National Intelligence Estimate, which is a collection of all the US government's intelligence agencies and their estimate on a particular issue when they released these reports. So the National Intelligence Estimate from 2006 said that the war had become a cause célèbre for global jihadists and had bred an entire new generation of fighters for this cause. And we saw that in the statistics. In every country that the United States either bombed or invaded post 9/11, the rate of terrorism in that country grew as militants took advantage of the chaos, as jihadists came in from elsewhere, as new grievances bred new enemies. And that's the story of our engagement in this region, is to basically exacerbate the terrorism problem that we went in to mitigate.
Well, John, I said that would be my last question. I lied. I want you to address one other issue before I let you go. The notion, and I touched on it a little bit earlier, about the Cold War era and just how much peace there was during the Cold War. What do you think of this notion that, this military behemoth that the United States has constructed keeps the peace?
Well, this is actually the core strategic rationale for our very expansive foreign policy, this notion that we have to be the dominant hegemon and maintain global order and peace. And it's true that the data do demonstrate a huge decline in the rate and instance of interstate war in the past 70 or 80 years, since about World War II. There's been more civil wars, there's been all kinds of ugliness, but the rate of war, traditionally defined between states, has gone down. And there's a lot of questions about why. There's a lot of academic research about why. And I think what is actually true is that there's a lot of forces pushing on this and trending towards peace. But it's not thanks to American foreign policy. So one idea is nuclear weapons came around in 1945. You have mutually assured destruction, and states start to evaluate the costs of going to war much differently. If it's possible to escalate to nuclear war, we're not going to do it, right? So that's one idea. Another idea is that nuclear weapons aren't that important, but the modern conventional capacity of industrial militaries to cause destruction and kill is massive. And so we learned from World War I and World War II that can destroy societies, upend empires, etc. And it's led to what international relations scholars refer to as defense dominance. That is to say, states see it as they're incentivized to be defensive as opposed to offensive. Another idea is economic interdependence. If you look at GDP of the world, mid-20th century, it starts to spike straight up like a hockey stick. And more people around the world are interconnected and depend upon each other in order to have economic growth. And so you're a little less likely to bomb another country if you depend on that country for goods and services. And that's another idea about why there's peace. A fourth one is norms, that norms have changed, right? We used to think of slavery as something that was just typical and ordinary and widespread and fine. And chattel slavery has been abolished. It's a thing of the past. Dueling used to be considered a proper way to resolve disputes between two people, and we think of that as barbaric now. And I think possibly something similar has happened with the notion of war. If you go back about 100 years, you can find leaders in the United States and Europe talking about war as something to aspire to. You know, it was a cleansing national experience that made a country manly and virtuous. And now I think even the warmongers tend to talk about war as something of a last resort. And the United States might be an outlier in this respect because we engage in a lot of military activism. But in general, that's what the trend says. And people like to say it's because the United States has this outsized role in the world, that we keep the peace, we deter enemies, we reassure allies, et cetera, and so forth. But the reality is there's a lot of reasons for that overall decline in interstate war over these years.
John Glaser, you've given us a lot to think about today. Thank you. Here's a final thought. Our capacity to wage war seems to be out of all proportion to the might of our adversaries, lightly armed militias such as the Taliban. Yet despite our power, we will exit Afghanistan just as we did tiny Vietnam, in defeat. On the next episode of History as It Happens.
There's no reason on earth why this fight to expose and remove communists and traitors from positions of power should be a contest between America's two great political parties.
At first glance, there may seem to be little in common between McCarthyism and Donald Trump's Stop the Steal campaign, but we're going to take a closer look when conspiracy theories implode. Next, when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.